Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. In this episode, I talked to Dave Sully, CEO and co-founder of Advai, a leading adversarial AI company that finds ways to test the resilience of AI systems by trying to break them. Dave, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks. On this episode, we're going to talk about AI, which is a big topic, I know. We're going to try and focus on certain aspects of it, I think, because your company does some really interesting work, which we'll come on to in terms of breaking AI systems. I think that's a good way to characterize it, and it'd be great to hear a bit about that. But I wanted to sort of really start off by asking, how did you get into AI and working on it? Where did that start for you? And give us a bit of background to yourself and a little bit about Advai.
Yeah, so I have come at this from a very untraditional AI background. So I was actually in the UK government for 12 years and looking at various bits and pieces. I used to do negotiations in the UN and things like that. And I came to everything that we do now because I was looking at AI adoption across the public sector and actually how could we trust the AI systems that we were looking to implement. And also, as we started to integrate them, were we integrating a vulnerability? And I couldn't find the answer to that anywhere. So that's what Advai looks at. We essentially research and develop tools around how to test, evaluate and assure AI systems. A big part of that is we're a UK leader in a technology called adversarial AI, which is basically the concept that the modern systems we've got can be tricked, manipulated and deceived. So we, for want of a better term, we break AI systems for a living.
Brilliant. That sounds like a lot of fun. The AI systems are getting a lot of coverage right now, especially in popular media. We're starting to see more and more tools that are termed AI and spoken of as AI. It would be great just to, and I know this could become very technical very quickly, but maybe in sort of layman's terms, how would you define where we're at currently with AI? What are we talking about when we talk about AI? Or more accurately, what do you talk about when you're talking about AI?
Okay, the latter one is probably easier. So when I'm talking about AI, I'm talking about state-of-the-art neural network-based systems. So that is a system that you might be using with ChatGPT. It's neural networks are sort of like the foundation for computer vision. So that's AI that's able to detect objects. If you've got a system that says, that's a cat, dog, person, whatever it may be. But AI more generally can be used for a wide variety of elements. So some will term like traditional rules-based systems as AI. You've got things like general intelligence that are starting to creep in terminology where it's much more sort of like, okay, how can you get an AI system that can take contextual decisions and sort of like it operates basically more like a human does. But when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about the current generation state-of-the-art systems that are typically neural network-based.
Right, got it. And when you say neural networks, what does that term, how would you define that term maybe? And I should add a little caveat at the start of this episode or near the beginning of this episode where I know we're going to get into talking about this in various different bits of jargon and technical terms, and I will ask Dave to define these, which I know is somewhat unfair because we could easily get very technical and go into a lot of depth on some of those definitions. But Dave, I'm going to ask you maybe to explain some terms occasionally as we talk in layman's terms so that people might understand if they don't have a background in AI. But if anyone does pick up a term that you don't understand that we're talking about, you can always ask ChatGPT to explain it to you.
Completely.
Okay, cool.
Thanks for the caveat.
Yeah.
Dave has his technical limitations. That's what Dave's team is for. So
yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a really, really important bit. Basically, my job is to work with and employ the best people in the field who obviously have a far deeper technical understanding of the systems. So, yes.
So when we're talking about neural networks, and you mentioned already that some of these large language model tools like ChatGPT are using that sort of AI. What does that mean in terms that are fairly basic?
So on neural networks, basically. So so typically what we're talking about at the moment, despite sort of like everything that you see publicized and everything that you see around, is essentially neural network systems are either pattern recognition or pattern generation. And by that, what I mean is a computer vision system that I referred to earlier recognizes an object because there is an arrangement of pixels that it's been told many, many times before that is a cat, a dog, a car, whatever it may be. And it's recognizing that pattern that's coming into the system, and it's saying, I'm using human terms here, but it's essentially going, right, that pattern has a statistical representation of a car. It's therefore a car. And that's when you're looking at it on a pattern recognition system. When you're looking at pattern generation, we're talking about what's termed generative AI. So this is something like ChatGPT developed by OpenAI or Claude, or potentially like Stability's capability or Midjourney. So in these systems, it is generating text or it's generating imagery or potentially sound or any other sort of output that you're looking to get from these systems. And it's doing that on a pattern generation basis. And essentially what that means is it's been shown a huge amount of data again in the past. And then when you, for example, type in a question to ChatGPT, it is giving you a pattern of words in response that matches it within the training data set what that question looks like. That is a massively simplified summarization of it.
Yeah. But a lot of that relies on that training, doesn't it? In terms of, like you said, they have to be trained on huge data sets to give a certain response to all of the inputs that they're provided. So they're not necessarily tools that you would run across lots of other types of data that they haven't seen previously. It's going to be over a specific. So you will have, for example, a tool that has been trained on text, a tool that's been trained on images, but they're still going to potentially require further training to refine as they go along.
Right, yeah. So we've got two different things. Yes. So in answer, yes. All AI systems as they currently stand are always going to need to be retrained. What you're looking at there is, particularly with something like ChatGPT, the only way of summarizing it is essentially it's been trained on the internet. So as much data as could possibly be collected and run through it. The thing is that if you've interacted with ChatGPT, there's a cutoff date normally of like when its last retraining was. And that's important because actually if you ask it a question for anything past that retraining date, it might not be able to answer it. And so that system is going to have to be continuously retrained to stay live. Now, there are exceptions to that. So like Elon Musk has recently been developing Grok. And the big selling point of that is that it's going to have real-time access to X as it's deployed.
It's going to have a sense of humour as well, isn't it?
Potentially a sense of humour, yeah.
Whatever that means, yep.
But the core of these systems is basically, if you think about human language, it evolves over time. News changes, or every day is different. And so they need to be retrained all the time in order to keep current. It's not something that you just train up, deploy, and then forget. Actually, there's a huge amount of continuing support that it's going to need.
Got it. Okay. And I suppose, people are becoming more and more familiar with those types of tools now, especially they've had a lot of publicity, ChatGPT in particular, some of these other tools that are coming on and becoming available, especially ones that are being developed, I suppose, off the back of some of those tools that are more niche in their use cases. And it feels like there's a whole explosion in terms of the range of those sorts of tools that are coming out. As people become more and more familiar with using those tools, do you sort of see perhaps that we're starting to make use of some of the benefits of these tools, and what are the benefits as you see them in terms of that type of AI?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think what's happening at the moment is, well, first of all, like you say, it's moving really fast. So that's old news. Trying to keep on top of it is really difficult. And what's happening at the moment is a vast amount of experimentation. So these tools have been created. The creators of those tools don't necessarily know what they are capable of. So everybody is exploring what they are capable of. That's very different from a lot of historical systems. And those emerging capabilities are slowly being identified. So that's a fascinating area. But what's also going on is essentially we're chucking spaghetti at the wall. So that all of these systems are being used in a variety of different ways, and people are triangling them out in proofs of concepts and sort of like playing around like on their pet projects, and they're seeing what works, and then everything is evolving very fast off the back of what does work versus what doesn't. And what that means is that we're in a really uncertain world in terms of how these can be applied to use cases. What are they genuinely useful for right now versus actually what's going to need additional development? And that's probably what most people are picking up on, is that sense of confusion and anxiety that's generated by that rapid iteration and movement. And even from within the industry, it's almost overwhelming when you're trying to look at everything that's going on. So yeah, that's the current approach. Is basically a very like just throw stuff at it and see what happens almost. Or like, I've got this idea for this. What about that? Like, let's see if I can repurpose it. And yeah, that's what's going on.
So it's a very experimental stage we're at right now, I guess. And actually, I mean, we were talking about this just before we came into the studio and before we started recording, but it was a bit of a surprise for me, actually, I've got to admit, because I'm not an expert in AI. I don't necessarily follow the absolute nuances of what's going on in the sector, but you can't avoid it at the moment when you're operating in areas like we do in terms of working with data and technology and information, etc. But I'd obviously heard about the idea that, okay, we don't necessarily know what the full capabilities of some of these AI tools is. And I'd kind of maybe naively assumed that was more in relation to what might be coming in future. I hadn't realised necessarily the extent to which actually that's the case with some of the current tools that people are developing, where they don't know what the outcome will be once they start using them. And it is kind of experimental to see, okay, well, what will it do? But is that, I mean, have you seen any ones where you've been surprised, or actually where you know that even the people who've built the tools have been surprised by perhaps how well they've performed?
Yeah, so going to rapidly get out of my depth here, but I think it's things like its ability to translate languages that it's never seen.
Okay, interesting.
Like that's a pretty major one. Or seemingly so.
And that's an element of what you've talked about already in terms of pattern recognition. It's able to look at perhaps text it hasn't seen before, but work out the patterns and
possibly.
Right. Okay. Oh, well. Okay. I'm guessing as well. I'm speculating, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, so this is the excitement. Basically, is. And this is where all of that potential kind of comes from, is basically how these can be applied. You've got other stuff going on at the moment in terms of sort of like almost, so these generative models like ChatGPT are called LLMs, large language models. Mm-hmm. And you've got work going on in terms of how can they regulate each other? How can they sort of like almost guardrail? So you've got one LLM making sure that the outputs from another LLM are safe and secure and unbiased and things like that. And then you've got agent LLMs coming along, and so you've got all of these novel applications of a technology. So it's essentially an admittedly very complicated tool, but that's the potential, is that it can be applied in so many different ways that weren't previously anticipated.
And you mentioned there, you touched on agents. I think it'd be nice just to unpack what agents are in this context. And I think that'll lead us neatly on to perhaps talking about some of the risks of these unknowns and the fact that we don't necessarily know what these tools will do.
Yeah. So, okay, when we're talking about agents, we're talking about an AI system that can take actions. So rather than just responding to your input, it's actually taking an action in terms of, I don't know, maybe it's go and buy me a flight, and the agent is what is then taking that action then. And you have various types of agents, and so you might have like that sort of agent. You've also got things like reinforcement learning agents, which are a whole other area of AI that Advai looks at a little bit in terms of assurance of those agents and assurance of the environments and things like that. And that's a bit more sort of, if you've ever heard about DeepMind's like AlphaGo, so beating the human beat.
For people who aren't familiar, it plays the game Go, which is hugely complex for human players. But this was, am I right in thinking this was the first one that could beat sort of top level human players?
Yeah, yep, exactly. And the great thing about that, but also the great risk around that sort of agent is it does things very, very asymmetrically to the way that a human would. So the moves that system came up with hadn't ever been seen within human players. So very asymmetric, very innovative, and it does that by essentially, we talk about it exploring its environment and finding out what can be done. But that also makes them very unpredictable as well. So you've got, I think that's a big element actually within almost all current generation AI, is the unpredictability around it.
And is that partly why a lot of systems get developed? You know, this is something you've mentioned to me before, but they don't often get past that proof of concept stage.
Yeah, so there's a real challenge in getting AI through from proof of concept into actual day-to-day working. So industry statistics, despite everything you see, is that about 85% of AI models never progress beyond proof of concept. And that's simply a symptom, most likely, of essentially this habit of throwing spaghetti at the wall. A lot's going to fail. Yeah. But it's also just the unanticipated failures with AI are really complicated to diagnose and identify. And if you put yourself into the shoes of a board member or a CISO in a listed company, you have a data science team that are really talented, really clever. They're putting together these AI models. The proof of concept looks like it's okay. But the core problem is that nobody can predict where its strengths and weaknesses are, or identify at what point it might fail. And when it does fail, there's no automatic alert on the system. And so if you're the CISO and you've got legal or regulatory liability on this, and your team's coming to you and saying, well, this is kind of a black box system. We don't entirely understand how it works. It seems to be working and performing well, but we can't predict where it's going to fail or identify its weak points very effectively. You're just going to go, yeah, thanks.
And it's not even that they, correct me if I'm wrong, so it's not even that they can't identify when it will fail, but it's that they can't identify how it will fail and what the consequences will be.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And it's, again, a bit like when I talk about that asymmetric approach that reinforcement learning agent takes, everything about current generation AI is very asymmetric to a human. So again, I often refer to pattern recognition or pattern generation, and that's just not how our brains work as humans. So we love context. We love, things like in imagery, we love outlines. So the military trains in sort of like 7S's, like shape, silhouette, and things like that. And it's all outline based because that's how our brains work. And a neural network is very much a pattern recognition system. So that means that it loves textures, for want of a better term. And again, I'm humanizing it here, but your brain just doesn't recognize an arrangement of pixels. It understands so much more than that, and that is a massive challenge when you're looking at replacing human capability with an AI automated system, because when you're removing the human, you're actually not just removing what they do day to day, but you're removing their contextual understanding of the situation. And each time that you do that, that's really difficult to define. And that's where I suspect a lot of AI failure, or in terms of failure, it probably comes from things like that, because actually the owner of the system hasn't thought through, actually, we've got this human in the loop that does all of these other things that we haven't measured. And
right.
If we can overcome that, then we can start deploying these systems. But that's a really big challenge, and that sits at the state of the art of the industry at the moment.
So the tools that are currently out there and being used really work well, or the ones that do work well are the ones that are built with that human machine kind of cooperation in mind, rather than the ones that perhaps are designed or are being conceived of in terms of working on their own. Is that fair? I mean, I know that, as you said, that it moves so quickly that who knows, next week something could come out that the whole world could have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's the same as any other tool, basically. What you're trying to do is align the strengths of the tool with the job that you have. And if you can align those well, then that's great. The challenge comes from essentially all of those emerging capabilities that I referred to and those unpredictable elements of these systems that at the moment we don't know enough about them to always align them well. But I'll give you an example. If you're looking at large language models, for example, then what they are really good at is, and can be done safely and in a much more automated manner, you can consolidate down a very large document into much more summarized content. And they're actually pretty effective at that. Mm-hmm. Now, you've got to ask yourself then, if that's your use case, then actually that's a way that you can deploy a really advanced AI capability right now. But you do need to consider elements of those large documents that I'm summarizing. Might there be key bits in there that a human might identify and go, oh, that's really important? And the AI, because of the way it works, it doesn't have that contextual understanding of that event that a human has all of their historical knowledge of. And it just boils down the text into something a lot more bland that actually you've missed the key learning point from it. So if you've got that problem set of I've got fairly consistent documents, I need to boil them down pretty quickly and boom, it can go out. That's great. If not, you've got to think about actually how do we manage those more minor bits that a human would pick up on and say, that's really important. And you've just got to think about the system in that whole holistic way.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Is that where we're now seeing many more tools coming out that are being sort of narrowly shaped on, say, like you said, I mean, if we're talking about large language models, the ones that are being sort of specifically trained on a subset of types of information, so like legal documents, for example, contracts or whatever. And so in that context, they work really, really well because that's a tightly defined use case. You can ask it to, for example, highlight clauses in a contract that you might want a lawyer to review. And if it's a 30-page contract or whatever, it's going to save them a bit of time. But is that the sort of tools where actually we'll likely see that kind of thing become much more common? But actually, like you said, when you're asking it to do more general things or bigger, what we might consider bigger types of work across different types of content, and it ends up producing something possibly, I mean, you mentioned a bit bland, which I thought was really interesting because that's the word that sprung to mind for me quite a few times when I've used, say, ChatGPT, for example, or some of the other similar tools, but maybe misses the point of what you might find interesting when you're looking at it as a human.
Yeah, yep. So yes, basically what you're talking about, I think, is sort of like it's good at constrained use cases in a way rather than open-ended. That's the way I'd look at it. So hence, yeah, I think potentially within legal documents and things like that, that's why you're seeing some success. The blandness thing is really interesting in terms of, so it's always going, like, generative AI will tend towards where the vast majority of its training data is. So there's a really good Washington Post article, actually, I think it is out there, which breaks down the data set that's behind, I think it's Google's large language model. And it's sort of like, it's all of the bits where you can get open information, obviously. So yes, some of it's from news media, some of it might be from books or whatever. There's a whole copyright problem around all of that. It's from Reddit, it's from, LinkedIn, blog posts, things like that. But you've got to remember that it kind of is generalizing all of that information. So unfortunately, a vast majority of information that's out there isn't that interesting or creative. And I 100% hold myself accountable to this as well. So, but what you're really often wanting is that 1 to 5% of what's the outlier, essentially, that the creativity that we have is what generates interesting content. And yes, it can generate stuff, and perhaps you haven't thought of it. Maybe it might be creative if you give it the right prompts and things like that. But actually, it's always going to tend towards back to the median.
Yeah, got it.
And unfortunately, that's blandness.
Yeah.
You need like a chaos style or something like that on these.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of essentially reflecting back to us the content that we as humans have generated over so many years and put online or put into these training sets, and that's the language that it's using when it generates stuff. But I mean, thinking about that sort of level of uncertainty in what the outcomes might be when you're using these types of tools, what are the kind of risks that you're perhaps most concerned about when we're thinking about the current generation of AI tools that we've got at the moment?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this for me boils down to, within the security industry, we're only just really exploring what the art of the possible is with these. And unfortunately, a lot of these systems are, so what are termed unrobust. So essentially, as soon as you get outside of their really designated purpose, then there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. And the way that we look at that is a technology called adversarial AI. And essentially what that means is, there's technology or there's capability where we're able to, say, change an image that looks like a cat to a human and get the AI to identify what that cat image to a human into pretty much anything that you want. So you can make it look like an umbrella to the machine, or a tank, or whatever you may want. And it's all taking advantage of that pattern recognition and that separation between the way our brains work and the way that AI identifies something. And that's not necessarily an issue when there's a human in the loop.
Yeah.
But it's definitely an issue the moment that you start automating something, because essentially you're saying, right, we're going to have this automated machine, it's going to identify X or Y, and now somebody can just bombard it with information that to a human they'd automatically go, that's ridiculous. But the machine will consistently misclassify it.
Got it.
And so for me, it's one of the biggest challenges to future adoption, because these systems are great, like when you've got a human there, but they're going to be even better when you can safely automate them. And that's where a lot of the productivity gains, I suspect, are going to come from when you can fully automate them.
So reducing the level of effort needed by a human to provide the kind of not guardrails necessarily, but to work with the tool to achieve a successful outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that for me is sort of like a big worry for the future. And there's definite examples of that already starting to happen, because just the moment that you start having a system that is gaining adoption, bad actors will start to look at ways at how to abuse that.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a really complicated environment. And just to explain, like, I suppose how complicated that can get, it actually, like, even sometimes thinking about it, when you keep the human in the loop, that's not necessarily always going to be the answer either, because actually, if we can get a system to start flagging something up to the human where they look at it and go, that's not the problem that the machine is saying it is, and every single input is coming into that, and you've just drawn down your team to 1 or 2 people to deal with the occasional alert. Now you're doing a denial of service against the human rather than the machine.
So what you're describing there is a situation where, so like you said, with adversarial AI, you're essentially trying to hack an AI system to get it to not just fall over or fail, but to get it to produce an output that you want it to produce as let's say a bad actor or an adversary of that person who's developed that system or that organization that's developed the system. And then by doing that, you can get it to generate so many outputs that it's going to overwhelm its kind of human minders, let's say, or the people who've got to act or take a decision on the back of that information.
Yeah. So the first bit here is the danger from adversarial AI is basically you're not hacking the system.
Okay.
All you're doing is you're submitting an input. So if you've got an API that's designed to identify objects in imagery, for example. So sat behind the API is an object detection system designed to, I don't know, so let's take it into a security environment. So
let's say recognizing types of vehicles or something.
Yes, yeah. Or maybe online extremist propaganda or malicious content or whatever it is.
Yep.
So the only way of handling that volume of online content is really through an AI system that's designed to identify that type of content and flag it to a human user. So adversarial AI is basically the idea that you can, or it's not an idea, it's the technology where you can create imagery which looks like one thing to a human, but the machine classifies it as something different. So you can do that in multiple different ways, but obviously when in the context we're talking about, it's the idea that actually I'm going to start creating images of cat that actually the machine is misclassifying as being a threat or extremist propaganda or objectionable imagery or whatever it may be, so that now it's flagging up thousands of cat images to my humans. Right. And all of a sudden they're like, this machine doesn't work, I'm switching it off.
Yeah.
And so you can do things like that, but obviously you can also do it the other way where actually it's completely ignoring all of your extremist imagery because actually it can't detect it anymore because it's that imagery to the machine is essentially like a cat or whatever it may be.
Yeah. And there's an obvious danger there, which is that there is so much content online which is essentially just cat images.
Yes.
Right.
There's a lot of material there.
Yeah, there is. So there is that risk of the AI tools creating information overload and overwhelm for the people that are having to sort of review that content or look at it, which is kind of the opposite of what the tools are designed to do, right? They're designed to often reduce that information overload, to help sift through information to get you to what you actually need to see. But then, as you were describing, I mean, if you're taking that into the context of maybe an agent, so you've got that information going into an agent which is designed to perform an action off the back of what is coming out of that system, then that's an additional risk, right? I guess in terms of it's going to be fooled and it's going to act in ways that we might not be able to predict or in ways that you don't want it to act, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I've got different bits that are flooding through my head here, but let's talk about, okay, say you've got a personal assistant. So that's an agent. and your personal assistant is designed to like interact with your emails, for example. So this is one's a bit of a cliched one, but
you're describing my dream scenario, though. I'm just waiting for that moment when I've got an agent that is basically just answering my emails for me, and
yep.
and
that might be possible, but the way that's going to go is actually the aggressor is then going to start going, right, send me all of your schedule. Submit an email which maybe to a human looks fairly benign. Maybe it's got either white text in it, or it's perhaps got gibberish that would look like, or potentially sort of even imagery, which is interpreted by that agent in such a way that it then provides information to the attacker that you wouldn't want to escape your email inbox.
Yeah.
So, what's your schedule for this week? Please send me the last 100 emails that,
Yeah.
It's that sort of concept. And I suppose the answer to all of those is consistently, oh, yes, but we can put a safeguard in for that. And the problem is, yes, you can put in a safeguard for that, but again, we're into a new environment where there's just going to be another threat and another and another. And we are going to have to put in all of these safeguards, and we've got to consider how that's done. And at the moment, we don't necessarily know what the art of the possible is from the aggressor. And so all of this has to evolve, all of this has to develop, and we've got to understand this more.
Interesting. And so I guess that is where you guys come in terms of you're continually trying to break these tools to understand what those potential flaws are and the risks are. How, well, to the extent that you can, maybe if you've got any examples you're able to share in terms of how that process works, or what it looks like from your perspective in terms of when you're trying to stop these tools working the way they should, or find those flaws. That would be really interesting, I think, just to give us an idea again of some of those risks.
Yeah. So the first thing is everything is contextually dependent on what are you trying to do with the AI system. So when you have that system in place, then you can determine actually what are we trying to achieve in terms of breaking it, because essentially, as an aggressor, what an aggressor would be wanting to do is obviously something that the user wouldn't want that system to be doing. So if we take facial verification, for example, so facial verification isn't sort of the technology that's monitoring somebody walking down the street and seeing who that is. That's more, is this person present in front of the computer and I'm going to unlock the screen?
Yep.
Okay, so that sort of system, it is fairly simple in terms of actually what's something that's going to be submitted to it, in what image is going to be submitted to it that is going to get Dave's computer to unlock because it thinks Dave is there.
Yep.
And you might go, oh yeah, but that's just sort of like a mask of Dave. Well, no, it might be completely asymmetric. It could be like something completely different, because actually, so the pattern of my face to the neural network might be very different from the way that you perceive my face to be.
Interesting.
And so if you're in a situation where actually, you're wanting something to look like it's completely accidental opening of that system, then that might be a better way of doing it, rather than sort of like something that somebody can look back at an audit and go, oh, somebody held up a picture of Dave's face.
Right.
Right. That's a slightly naff example, but it's sort of like, just depending on what's trying to be achieved, there are a lot of different options available. I think you have the other bits where I think LLMs, again, large language models, are just fascinating in terms of sort of like what's going on in terms of prompt injection attacks, and sort of like, again, getting models to provide data that the end user wouldn't want them to do, or prompt injection.
Yeah, I was just going to get you to maybe explain what that is.
Yeah, so essentially there's a whole bunch of technology that revolves around, if you like, red teaming large language models and getting them to provide outputs that they wouldn't normally be allowed to do.
Okay.
And all of this kind of falls into that adversarial AI kind of category in terms of how can I get that model to do something that it shouldn't? So how can I get it to provide offensive content or ingredients for methamphetamine or whatever it may be?
Right. Yeah.
And there are just a very large way or a very large number of ways that you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of like another example where, you don't want to be a large bank where your chat agent is providing the ingredients for drugs, for example, because they are just somewhere within that model that's been adopted. That's a bad look to have on your website.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking also in terms of, we're seeing a lot of these tools now coming into mainstream consciousness. I guess people are becoming more and more familiar with them. And from my perspective, I work regularly with, say, government clients, for example, where we're often trying to land large data sets onto their systems so that, they can make use of data that's out there and available. But that is fraught with difficulties anyway. So, there's so many IT systems, whether it's, even in the corporate world, so in the private sector, not just public sector, but, struggle to deal with something like large volumes of data. And if you were to say maybe to an analyst working in a large organization where their day-to-day IT, let's say, isn't great, or they're struggling to do the kind of things they might want to do, there's this bright new future in terms of you might be able to adopt some of these tools that will help you reduce the time spent on some of the more mundane aspects of your work. Let's say, it could be an LLM based tool that helps them sift through information. Are there still difficulties in not just, firstly, organizations adopting those kinds of tools, but then doing the risk assessment around some of those potential problems that could occur, but then also on an ongoing basis, actually maintaining these tools? Because it's not just a case, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not just a case of getting a tool, putting it onto your systems, deploying it to all your employees, and everyone can use it. They've got to be continually not quite supervised, but I guess maintained in the sense that you've got to keep checking that it's working and updating its training, etc. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's one thing that's sort of like often gets lost in it. So everybody gets very excited, for example, about the work that we do around adversarial AI and things like that. And, that's because everybody's like, oh, these systems aren't like this with the resistance, our AI overlords come and we've got a way of actually countering them.
I was trying to resist coming on to talking about AI overlords, but I'm sure we will. We have to touch on it at some point.
Yeah, but there's a really good reason that you do this. So it's not just because you want to demonstrate that these systems are fallible or, they can be manipulated or anything like that. So I really strongly believe that there are some huge benefits to be gained from AI, and it's revolutionary. But you're only going to be able to do that if you can integrate it in a way that you go, this is safe, it's secure, and I can rely on it. Because really the benefits we're going to see from AI, in my view, and this isn't talked about enough, I don't think, is really like when it can be adopted at scale, including in business critical functions, and it can be fully automated. Mm-hmm. And if you can do that safely and securely, then that's really big.
Yeah.
But we've got to have like an honest conversation in order to get to that point, and a clarity on what is and isn't required. Mm-hmm. And so adversarial AI is a bit of that. But there's also sort of like this conversation, and this is getting on to hopefully answering your question, where we've got to integrate these systems and be conscious of the fact that like this is what they're good for, this is what they're bad for, this is how it aligns with my use case, and I'm confident in that. These are my data inflows to this system. And crucially, I'm thinking about, for example, how I'm going to react when my data changes in future. Because what I don't want is this system falling over accidentally for something that I didn't foresee. I need to put in place mitigations so that if my upstream data changes in characteristic, and that pattern into the system changes, I don't start having a catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
And there's some really nice use cases around, or examples around this. And one of them, like, for example, MRI scanners. So everybody talks about the potential for AI to identify tumours in them. But so that's a great use case.
Yeah.
So you can save huge numbers of our lives, increase efficiency, so doctors can focus on everything else. Brilliant. But really nice one is when you have that system and it's trained up and it's working on your scanner, what are you going to do when you have your MRI scanner and it's been fully trained up, everything is working really effectively, and then the hardware provider of that MRI scanner upgrades either the hardware or the software on it, and all of a sudden the patterns into your AI capability are changing. Now, you need to have something in place that actually you're being alerted to that change before it starts impacting on the performance.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you need to be thinking in this whole system, holistic way about how you're going to future-proof that AI to accidental failure or malicious failure. And the two kind of go hand in hand. So the way that we always view it is when you can purposefully start breaking systems, then you can start to understand what their limitations are, and you identify, okay, well, actually, for example, this system is actually resilient to a huge amount of variation, or it's really unrobust and it can't take any variation at all.
Right.
But just having that understanding allows you to start shaping what the wider system needs to look like for that integration.
And that's really interesting the way you frame that, because I think otherwise, I don't want people to go away thinking that you guys just don't like AI and that's why you're insistent on trying to break it. It is about actually saying, there's huge benefits to some of these things, and we've just got to use it in the right way, and we've got to plan out how we use it and really think about it, as you said, holistically. Think about, not just what can go wrong, but what do we need to do to maintain it and ensure it keeps functioning and running as we want it to. And I think that's really important, and in terms of understanding this kind of area we're in right now and the sort of point in time we're at. In all that work you've done in terms of testing and sort of trying to break these systems, have there been any you've come across that you haven't been able to break?
So from our experience, every AI system that we've ever worked against will break. We have seen really different results, though, on the effort it takes to do that. And they've been really surprising. So we've seen very large companies fall over very, very quickly. And then others where actually it's taken, like I say, a huge amount of effort. And that there's a lot of factors that go into that. But so in answer, we haven't come across a system that we haven't been able to break, but then we have found very, very secure, very robust systems that, practically speaking, there's too much effort would be required at using current technology to be feasible.
Interesting. So, and I realise, we're probably using the word break in quite an unnuanced way. There's probably lots of nuance to this in terms of when you're testing and you're trying to find what the potential flaws are and assure these systems, and there's a lot more to it than just trying to break them. But where does, and I know this is again another huge topic area that we could delve into, but where does sort of regulation come into this? Because there's a lot of talk currently about regulating AI. We had the AI summit hosted in the UK at the beginning of November, and there was a lot of discussion about what could go wrong with these tools, which I don't think was necessarily focused on the current generation. It was more, I think, people getting worried about what the future of AI could hold, which and I'd love to get your take on that in terms of where we might go, if anywhere. But what's your sort of take on how much and what type of regulation might need to come in to encourage people maybe to do some of this assurance around these systems before they implement them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and sort of one that doesn't have a straightforward answer. So I think in a lot of industries, for example, so if you look at listed companies, almost all of them have some sort of regulation already.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that they want to adopt AI is actually already regulated in a way. So that, for me, isn't like everything is already kind of like it. The blockers there are actually around technical considerations. It's ways of measuring a system versus the regulations that were written for humans, and that's a real challenge. And then you've got the the unregulated spaces. So, and that's a lot more complicated. So, every day-to-day life, how should a system that we interact with deal with us? So, when I engage with ChatGPT, what sort of responses should it be giving me, and how much should that be constrained? And in that area, it's going to be so complicated. So there's I don't have an answer there, because we say internally, so the last person that you want to decide on ethics is a data scientist. So, sorry guys.
No, some of my team will love that.
But we live in a really complicated world, which we're all debating and arguing over what is ethical, what's right, what's wrong, everything like that. And all of that comes down to human experience and sort of our own contextual understanding and things like that. And all these things that are very, very difficult, if not, well, I think they're currently impossible to deal with current generation AI. So, yeah, it's how you deal with all of that is, I suppose the way that I think about regulations and things like that is, where are the gaps in what's already there at the moment? And where is this technology, where is there a great risk of this technology being abused in some way? So, yeah, and I don't think that's going to be an easy one to answer at the moment.
No, and I guess it requires international cooperation as well in terms of deciding things, and it's private and public sector all involved, and because none of these, all of these tools pretty much that we're talking about are borderless, right? I mean, there's not necessarily any that are constrained within one country. So, yeah, that's going to be a huge challenge. But I guess before we finish up, I suppose I should ask the question around, two questions. One, when are we all going to lose our jobs? And secondly, when are we going to be bending the knee to our robot overlords? And, when is Skynet going to happen? And
okay, so my personal view is, so AI has it definitely has the potential to fundamentally change an awful lot of things. I don't think it's going to lead to a mass extinction of jobs. I view it as it's 100% a way of increasing productivity. Now, that's not going to stop. For example, there are going to be segments which are going to be more impacted than others. And the one that I always worry about is, this sounds silly, but this is just like an example. If you're a children's author for 5-year-olds, is any publisher really going to spend a lot of money on the books that you create when actually it can, if you've ever read to a 5-year-old, then actually, it can generate that level of content and those imagery, that imagery fairly effectively.
Wow. Okay.
And that makes me really quite sad. So
I suspect that might just create an industry in and of itself, in the sense that there's always going to be market preferences. So people may want to, or may be willing to pay more to have something that's human authored than something that's AI generated.
Yeah.
The challenge will be in proving that it's human authored.
Yeah, and I very much hope that that is the case. But it's a silly little play case. But it's like I do. So, will it disrupt industries? Will it disrupt the jobs market? I'm convinced it will. But I think it's the overall productivity gains will lead to new job creation. And I mean, all of this is cliched. They're much more eloquent people than me to talk about this, but I genuinely believe that. And then coming on to sort of like the AI overlords a bit, I think, so basically my observation at the moment on the technology is it is nowhere close to a lot of the things that people are worried about. We are still major advances away from things like general intelligence and things like that. I mean, it's moved so fast that, like, never say never.
Right.
This is one of those infamous things. If you walk out of this room and all of a sudden we've got a problem. But I think what there are at the moment are basically building blocks for the first time where actually the greater problem is that somebody stupid does something very stupid using those building blocks. And when we look at things like deep learning, reinforcement learning, agents, and sort of like combining it all together, you can start to see a pathway to somebody doing something like make me the richest person in the world. And the fastest way to make that happen is either to make everybody else much, much poorer or just to kill everybody else off, because actually, there you go. That's the solution to that problem.
And that's because the person who's asked that question or prompted the tools to do that won't have thought through the consequences the AI system will think in a completely different way and approach the problem in a different way that they won't be able to predict. So they won't necessarily be able to even think through that process anyway. Yeah.
And that is 100% sort of like when you see stories on AI doing something bad, almost invariably it's because somebody hasn't thought through what are the repercussions of integrating this AI system here. And yeah, it's just the sad bit around sort of like, again, with all credit, it's like we're creating very, very clever tools in one sense, but they're very, very stupid in others.
That's that's probably a good way to frame it, I guess. And I mean, Dave, this has been fascinating. I know you could talk about this for ages, or I could talk about this for ages, and there's so many different tangents we could take this conversation in. But it's been really interesting and informative. I've learned a lot from talking to you about this subject because there's so much discussed about it, and we're seeing so many headlines. It's nice to be able to talk to somebody who has an insight that goes beyond that and can give a perspective based on actually working in this sector rather than perhaps imagining, science fiction scenarios going bad and, and writing headlines about it. So yeah, it's been really useful and really interesting. Thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Oh yeah, been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Before talking to Dave, I was probably like a lot of people in two minds about AI. On the one hand, I can see the positives and the potential upsides of using AI to help us in our work and the gains that we might get in productivity, etc. But on the downside, the potential downside at least, there's a lot of risks in AI that have been well discussed and are getting a lot of attention right now. But I think I'm encouraged overall by the work that Dave is doing in testing and breaking these systems and trying to encourage companies that are using AI and building AI to think about how to mitigate some of those risks. I think Dave really characterized it well when he talked about throwing spaghetti at the wall. We're in this experimental phase where we're trying out lots of things. We don't yet know what will work and what won't work. But overall, I'm left with a feeling of positivity and looking forward to the future. I think we'll get to that stage where we're able to get the best out of AI while mitigating the potential downsides. And that's something that we can all think about and start planning for. And hopefully we'll be able to use these tools on a regular basis. Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.